You know, every single project lives or dies by its budget. But let's be honest, a simple list of estimated costs, that's not a budget. It's more like a wish list. Today, we're going to go way beyond that. We are diving deep into the determined budget process to forge a powerful, authorized cost baseline. Look, this isn't just about getting a number approved. It's about creating the financial backbone that will keep your project standing strong from day one all the way to the finish line. Let's get into it. So let's kick things off by tackling a question that, believe it or not, trips up a ton of people. We've estimated our costs, right? So we're done? No way. Not even close. There's a huge difference between a pile of cost estimates and a formal, approved project budget. See, an estimate is really just a prediction, but a budget is an authorized plan. Our whole job today is to bridge that gap and turn those raw numbers into an actionable, defensible financial tool. All right, here's our game plan. First up, we're going to define our ultimate goal, that authorized cost baseline. Then we'll walk through the two big steps, gathering all your key inputs, and then, actually building the budget. We're also going to do a deep dive on managing uncertainty with reserves. This part is absolutely crucial. And to wrap it all up, we'll look at the powerful financial blueprints you'll have in your hands at the end of this whole process. Okay, before we jump into the how, let's be crystal clear on the what. The whole point of this entire process isn't just to get a number signed off. No, it's to create a time-phased authorized baseline. This baseline becomes the single source of truth for your project's financial health. Think of it as the yardstick you'll use to measure every single dollar spent. Without it, you're not really managing, you're just guessing. So this definition, you really need to get this. The cost baseline. Let's break it down real quick. Approved version. That means it's official. It's got the stamp of approval from your sponsors. Time-phased. That means we don't just know how much we're spending, but when we're spending it. Big difference. And basis for comparison. That's its job. We're going to constantly check our actual spending against this line to see if we're on track, ahead, or, falling behind. Now check this out. The formal definition from the PMBOK guide adds one more layer here that's so important. I want you to really focus on this distinction. The baseline includes contingency reserves, but it excludes management reserves. This is not just project management jargon, okay? This is a fundamental rule for how we structure a budget to handle risk. We're going to do a full deep dive on this in a bit, so just park that thought. It's super important. All right, so how do we actually build this baseline? Well, it all starts with gathering our intel. And I don't mean just collecting a stack of documents and ticking a box. No. We are assembling essential puzzle pieces. Any skilled project manager knows the real magic happens when you synthesize all these inputs to make smart, defensible budget decisions. So here are the key inputs broken down into logical groups. First, you've got the project management plan. That tells us the how, our rules for managing cost and scope. Then you've got the project documents. This is the what, the detailed estimates, the schedule, the risks. Next, the business documents. This is the why. Why are we even doing this? The business case tells us. And finally, you have agreements for any external costs. A top-tier PM doesn't just collect these, they weave them all together to make sure the budget isn't just accurate, but it's actually aligned with what the project is trying to achieve. And now we get to the fun part. This is the engine room. This is where we take all that raw intel we just gathered and we actually start to build a structured, coherent budget. It's all about building it up from the bottom and then checking and balancing everything. So what we're looking at here is the classic bottom-up approach, cost aggregation. It's simple, really. We start at the bottom with the cost estimates for individual activities. Then you just aggregate or roll those up into their work packages from your WBS. Now here's a key move. Those work packages get rolled up into something called control accounts. Just think of a control account as a mini project inside your main project. It's a management point where you track scope, schedule, and budget. And when you add up all those control accounts, boom, that's your cost baseline. Okay, so we've got our cost baseline, which covers all the work we know about. But what about the stuff we don't know about? The truly unexpected? This is where we add one last very important piece on top of the baseline, and that's called the management reserve. It's a special pot of money for unforeseen work, and, as we said before, it's kept separate for a very good reason. And there it is, the cost baseline, which has all your work package costs plus contingency, plus that management reserve. That equals your total authorized project budget. Understanding this difference is what really separates the pros from the amateurs. The baseline is what you, the project manager, actively manage every single day. The total budget includes that extra buffer that's controlled by senior management for those big, unforeseen hits. Now, before we lock this thing in, we have to run it through 3 final stress tests. First, we look at historical info. Does this budget pass the sanity check against other projects we've done? Second, and this is a big one, we do what's called funding limit reconciliation. It's not enough to know how much money you need. You have to align your spending with when the money is actually available. If you need a huge chunk of cash in month 2, but finance only gives you funds quarterly, you've got a problem. You have to fix that now, probably by rescheduling some work. And finally, for the really big projects, there's financing, which is the whole process of actually getting the capital. And now for that deep dive I promised you. Look, any PM who's been around the block knows that things go wrong. It's just a fact. A budget that doesn't plan for uncertainty is a budget that is absolutely doomed to fail. So this is where we get strategic, and we plan for the risks we can see coming, and also for the ones we can't. So the question is, how do you actually do that? How do you put a dollar figure on uncertainty? The answer is not to just pad all your estimates. That's the amateur move. The professional approach is to use 2 very different types of reserves, and each one has its own purpose and its own rules. Okay, listen up, because this right here is probably the single most critical concept for managing a budget like a pro. Let's break it down. Over on the left, we have contingency reserves. This is your money for the known unknowns. These are risks you've already identified in your risk register. Like a vendor might be late, costing you some overtime. The key things to remember: this money is part of the cost baseline, and it's controlled by you, the project manager. Now on the right, we have management reserve. This is for the unknown unknowns, the big, crazy things you never saw coming. A sudden change in regulations, maybe. This reserve is not in your baseline, and it's controlled by senior management. To get it, you have to submit a formal change request. If you can master this one distinction, you have mastered funding for project risk. So after all that work, what do you actually have? Well, you've got your authorized financial blueprints. And these are not just some static documents you file away. Oh no, these are living, breathing tools that are going to guide every financial decision you make from here on out. All that work boils down to 2 critical outputs. The first is one we know well by now, the cost baseline. This basically answers the question, what's our plan for spending money over time? But the second one is the project funding requirements. This answers a totally different but just as important question for the business. Okay, when do you actually need the cash? Let's see how that looks. And honestly, the best way to see these 2 outputs working together is with this chart, the classic S-curve. This one single graph tells a really powerful story about your project's entire financial plan. This visual really brings it all together. You see that smooth blue S-curve? That's your cost baseline. That's your planned spending over time. And as the project goes on, you'll plot your actual spending against it to see how you're doing. But see those yellow steps? That represents your project funding requirements. It shows the total amount of cash that needs to be available, including that management reserve. That's why it steps up above the baseline. It's the total funding the sponsor has to make available, usually in chunks over time. So, to put a formal definition on it, the project funding requirements doc spells out the total funds you need, which is that cost baseline plus the management reserves, and, just as important, the periodic needs. It answers the question, when do we need the money? This is the document that your finance department is going to use to make sure that the cash is actually in the bank when you need to pay your bills. And that brings us right to our final thought. You've done the hard work. You've rolled up the estimates. You've analyzed the risks. You've established your reserves. And you've gotten your baseline approved. You have a solid, defensible budget. So the big question is, what now? How are you going to monitor your performance against this baseline and manage all the changes that you know are coming? How will you protect it? Well, my friends, that is the art of cost control.